Now that most of the building is standing, we can move forward and start working on the landscape. We're first going to make the landscape, and then we'll place the rocks and the lava on top. And once we're done with that, we can finally move on to lighting and reflection capture actors and various other things. So the landscape system, it's very similar to UDK. So if you worked with UDK before, not that much change, definitely not the basics. The biggest change really is the interface. So the interface here in the editor is entirely new, but the functionality and the way you do everything, that's 100% the same, especially when it comes to the basics of it. So if you go to if you click on the landscape tab here, you automatically see this green grid show up. That's the landscape. Feel free to move it. So I'm going to move it close to my building here. I'm going to just leave all the settings be. So 63 by 63 quads is just fine. 1 by 1 section. I mean, all of it is fine. We don't need to have it this big though. You can see this last row of sectors is kind of useless because the rock will be here. You know, the rock wall will end over here at the building. So you're never going to see this. So I'm actually going to take that away, I think. You can take it away by changing the number here. So this 4 by 4 represents the 4 by 4 number of rows and columns. So if I type 3 there, for example, that was the wrong direction, but this, for example, you get this instead. So you could do that, but you can also simply drag on the edge. So you can see if you position your mouse over the edge, you get a different mouse cursor. And if I now click and drag, I can also resize the terrain like this. It should also be noted I can also do this after the terrain has already been generated, okay? Even while you have to pick the size now, you can freely adjust and add cells to it basically later on. The size you pick right now is not definite and it's not set in stone. I'm gonna go for something like this. You can also define the material here. You might already want to set that to make things easier. Look for lava landscape, lava terrain actually. Lava terrain is a material called lava terrain. That material, by the way, is largely set up the same as it would have been set up in UDK. I can quickly open it. I don't want to go very deep into this, not a material editor tutorial, but the whole system of using landscape coordinates and then using texture samples going to layers, and the layers have a name defined, and then it just stacks up like so. That's identical to UDK. So it's very straightforward. There is a different way of doing it as well now with terrain layer thingy here, but I just use the old system and it works just fine. So once you've set everything you want to have, you can simply press create and you have your landscape. Then we should paint some hills and some lower areas in it. It's quite flat here, as you can see. Actually, I'm first going to raise it a bit. So I'll go out of the landscape mode back to the first one. So I can just select it and move it, and I'm gonna move it up a bit. It should also be noted that besides rescaling the landscape by extending the cells out of it, by adding more cells, you can also simply change the scale on the landscape. So you can also simply do that. You can see here the scale, so I'll set the scale back to 100 as it was. But again, you can simply do this if you want it wider. I'll go back to the landscape tab. Make sure we're in the sculpt mode. Sculpt mode means we can paint the terrain to go up and down. Paint mode means we can paint textures on it. So I'll start with sculpt mode. You can see here then this is how it paints. It's a smooth. This is the fall off basically of the brush you're painting with and the type of brush you're painting with. So you have some advanced features here. You can actually define a pattern brush and such. But I'll just stick to the basics. Make sure this is set to sculpt. That's it. And then set the radius. I have it to 2048, but actually a bit larger might be good. If it's larger, it tends to be easier to work with in the beginning when you're shaping up the rough dimensions of the terrain. Then tool strength, I tend to set it quite low, 0.1 for example. And then we can begin painting. If you hold Control and you left click and drag, it will paint up. You can see now I made a hill. If you hold Ctrl Shift and you left click and drag, or just left click, it will go down. So holding Ctrl will make it go up, holding Ctrl Shift will make it go down. I'm gonna paint kind of what I had in my other level, so that means it's a bit deeper near the building. It's higher in the middle, there's another pit over here. And it's a bit higher around the edges. I'm gonna paint this up a bit. Might be hard to see. There's no lighting. Without lighting it's especially hard to see. It's all kind of the same. But let's try in wireframe. Actually it's still quite hard, but you can see it's kind of deformed the terrain. This is a very basic landscape we have here, so there's not much advanced stuff going on, but that's the basics. You can also use some of the other tools, for example smooth, that will smoothen it out, so it kind of averages out. So it's particularly useful. I tend to use sculpt to quickly sculpt in the general shape of the landscape, but you might end up sometimes with some rough shapes or too steep hills or anything like that. So I quickly shape it up using sculpt, and then I would use smooth to smooth everything out and make it a bit more natural. I tend to keep everything very smooth and very soft. A landscape system is basically a grid. You can see at the wireframe, you know, it's just a grid of polygon quads. And that means it's not very natural. So I tend to avoid having steep hills or anything that would give away the fact that it's basically a grid. It's a perfect grid, so it's far from natural. So I basically have this. It shouldn't be too much. It's a very simple terrain here. You got some other tools as well. You got flatten, which could be nice. So where you begin to click, and all of these tools work in the same way. You press and hold Control, and you just click and drag around. Where you begin to click with the flatten tool, and then you drag it around, it will flatten everything out to the same height as to where you began your move. So if I take the top of the hill here, you can see the other side of the hill is quite low. If I begin clicking here and I drag there, it makes the other side the same height. If I begin clicking here, however, on the lower part, and I drag, it makes everything else as low as that as well. You got some erosion tools, hydro erosion and erosion, but they only really work if your height map is of such high detail that it can actually show the erosion taking place. Otherwise it just gets jaggy. So again, I tend to avoid that, and I tend to make all the things that are jaggy or that need high detail, I tend to do those with meshes. The landscape I only tend to use for like soft hills and beaches and anything that's quite flat. It falls off the resolution here, but underneath hydro erosion would be noise. It's not that useful either to my experience. It tends to just make jaggy edges as well. And then there's a couple of more advanced features that I don't want to go into right now. So this is a basic landscape introduction. So this will do. Then we should paint the terrain. So we have a basic sculpted terrain here, landscape terrain. So then we should paint the textures in. You can go to the paint tab here, and you can see you have rock, lava, rock, sand, and dirt. These are the ones defined in the material. So it automatically took that selection over from the material, and it will now allow me to paint with one of those four. Before we can start painting, we first, however, need to define the layer info. So you can see if you have these boxes underneath saying none, 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 none. This is different from UDK. So every layer needs to have a layer info present. If you click here on the none, you will see there's only one present that matches this. So simply take that one each time. If you would have done this from scratch, because now it uses my Solus content, so if you would have done this for your own project, you wouldn't have these present. Then all you would have to do is simply press a plus. So at the beginning, for example, I can't even apparently clear it actually. But if you wouldn't have anything here, there would be a small plus on the right side of it. If you press that small plus, you can let it generate this. So this is simply generated. It doesn't do anything else. You don't have to edit it. You don't have to do anything with it. Just press the plus. Let the editor generate it in the location that you define. Save that, and then just define it here and start painting. Also, each time you paint a new material, especially the first time when you begin painting, you can see it's textured right now, and the moment I begin painting, everything goes black. That's normal. It's simply because it's the first time you began using the landscape. So I tend to simply repaint the entire terrain for a moment in the beginning with the same material, just to make sure that all the blackness is gone. And then you can paint the other one, so I'll just very quickly paint things on it. Also, it should be noted that the first time that you combine different materials and different layers together, it has to recompile the shaders, which causes it to go white for a while until it did that. For example, if I take the third layer here, you can see it also has to recompile shaders, and then it momentarily goes white. Same there. So you can simply paint on it like that. You can see the textures blend together. Should do it with a bit more care than I do here, so let me fix it up a bit. I will take the lava rock and paint that near the pits, because these lower areas, they will contain lava. So I'm gonna make the brushes a bit smaller. We also have a tool strength here. I'm gonna set it to 1, which works much better for lava, otherwise it's more translucent. Like so. There's a fall off here. You can see this number controls the inner radius. If you put it to a lower value, it will have a much harsher edge, so a more contrasted edge. If you put it to 1, it's basically a soft dot. You can see the blue glow that comes from it. It basically paints like that. So for the lava, I'm going to set it to quite contrasted. And I probably have to adjust this later on once I've placed the meshes, because right now you can't really see what you're doing, since there are no meshes for reference. So we'll probably have to change it, but it's just have a bit of a starting thing to work with. I can go even smaller here. You can see I can paint sand. For sand it's a bit harsh. With this fall off range, I'm going to go a bit higher. To make sure that the terrain isn't too boring, I also tend to mix it up a lot. Like paint a little bit here and there. You can see. So you kind of alternate between two different materials, between the stone here and the sand, just to make it a bit less repetitive. You have a number of similar tools here, for example smooth, that will try to smooth textures together, so fades them together more. I can try to do that on for example here, but I don't tend to use it that much. I tend to work mostly just with paint and change these 3 settings, and it tends to be enough for most things. You got flatten as well, but again it's not that useful. I think for most cases you might as well just paint. You can see this is pretty much similar to painting. So, and you got noise, which will try to add some variation to it, but again it doesn't work that well. I think kind of hard to control, so again you might as well just use paint and stick to that only. Also regarding the landscape, it should be noted that if you were to look in the properties here, you can set it to lot. It lots already anyway, but the lot settings are not very aggressive at all, so you can make it more aggressive, more optimized. You can see it doesn't really lot away. If it lots, it would only lot on a very long distance. So in the properties here it says max lot level. If you were to increase that to, for example, 4 and do something with a lot distance factor. So if I set this and this to 4, you can see then it starts to lot much more. So if you need more performance, you might want to consider changing this. In particular the distance, I think this was, you can also reset values, by the way, if you press this little arrow here on the right and then you reset it to default values. So the higher the lot distance factor, the faster it will lot. And the max lot level is the maximum it allows. You can see if I set max lot level 2, it will never lot further than the second step. So the higher this number, the more aggressive it gets basically. It should also be noted you have a static lightning lot here. This is the detail of the lightning on the terrain. So if you increase this, you will get more. In fact, the light resolution, if you increase the lighting resolution, in particular, for example 4, you will get 4 times as detailed lighting on the terrain. It does also increase the rebuild times, however, so you shouldn't overdo it. I'm going to leave it at 1 for this terrain over here. And also to round up this part, as mentioned before, you can freely extend or take parts away from the landscape. So if you go back to the landscape tab here, you have a manage button here, and then you can add or delete sectors. So you can do, for example, add, and you can see then I can add a new part somewhere to the landscape. So for example, I can say I want a new part there. If you then control click while the area is green, it will give you a new part of the landscape. In the same way, you can also delete parts. So you can do delete, control click when it's red, and it's gone. I will tweak the terrain some later on when all the meshes are placed, but now we have a basic landscape or terrain in place. We should round it up by doing the surrounding rocks. We're going to begin placing those. They are located in landscape meshes. It's not that many of them, so it's quite a small selection of them. I'm going to begin with the biggest rocks. I always start with the biggest rocks to block out the general shape of the area. And the biggest rocks are basically these big ones over here at the bottom. I'm going to start with that. Like this should do. They're quite small, so I'm actually going to scale them to 2. You can see I type 2 here in scale. See how that works out. It might be a little bit too large almost, but seems to work. Make sure not to just make a flat wall. Place some things behind the wall as well. With a wall I mean don't just make rocks that surround the level. Place some things behind those rocks as well, so it gets more depth. So you can see rocks in the distance and such. Tends to work better. This one works well as well. Rock big 1. Once you have some rocks standing and you have the basic shape of the area blocked out, you can bring in some extra detail. So I've got some small rocks here, various small rocks, and we got these pillars. I'm gonna start placing both of those. Okay, so then we have the basic terrain laid out with rocks. Most of the detail is there. It's quickly done. It's done with only a couple of meshes. I have more detail in the full game, but you understand the idea and you understand how I built these environments up. The next step would be to tweak the landscape a bit, because now we have all the meshes placed. We can tweak it a bit more. For example, this I think might be a little bit deep, low compared to the rest of the areas. This hill is a bit steep, etc. So I'm going to go over it again and tweak everything to a bit more final state. Also, one feature that might be nice to mention is that you can lock the landscape, because you might accidentally move it. It's very easy to select because it's all over the level. So you can lock it, and that's what I usually do. If you right click the landscape, or for that matter any other actor, you can also lock, for example, this mesh, but right click the landscape, transform, and then it's just off the screen here, but then in transform it says lock actor movement. If you do that, you can no longer accidentally move it. See? At this point, it would also be a good idea to place the lava plains, so you have a bit of a better view on where exactly the lava is located. So I'm going to do that. The lava plane is a simple plane with the lava material assigned. There's a couple of simple planes in general meshes. A couple of different planes here. They're all about the same size, or actually exactly the same size, but they have different poly counts. So for example, I can quickly open this one. If you look at the wireframe of this, it's just 2 triangles. If you look at the last one, it's a lot more than 2 triangles. So it's different densities. I'm going to take a medium density one. I don't want just 2 triangles, because it will, the distance fog works on the vertices of the mesh. So if you take a too low poly one, it's going to mess up the material later on. I know that from experience, so I'm going to take the number 4. I think that's a good in-between one. Drag it into the world, and then we'll scale it until it's the correct size. In fact, what you can do is you can simply scale it so big that it covers the entire level. And I'll explain why in a moment. But this gives us a good view on where the lava would be, what the lowest parts of the terrain would be, which is there, there, and there. And I think that's perfectly acceptable, so I'm going to just stick to that. And then before we apply the lava material, there's a couple of things to note here. First of all, in the properties here, it says, if you expand several of these settings, first of all, it's casting a shadow. You can see it casts a shadow. That would be weird. Lava shouldn't be casting a shadow, so I'll take shadow casting off of the mesh, and it shouldn't have collision either. So somewhere in here it says collision. It says collision preset block all. So I'm going to set that to no collision. And also, as with most things, you can simply type something here also. So if you can't find it in the list, just type collision, and you get all results automatically. Then the lava material, located in effects in general, I believe. Or sorry, in landscape materials. Just click and drag that one onto this here. There we go. There's a small one here, so I'm gonna paint that one out, and I'm gonna adjust the landscape texturing, because the red part here isn't really very defined. So I'm gonna paint a little bit better now I know where the lava is located. Let me first quickly fix this little area here. I'm gonna raise it a bit up. So I'll take sculpt mode, a bit of a bigger brush, low strength. And by the way, you have a slider here. You can see you can slide all the way up to 8192, but in fact you can also just type a larger number than that and it would accept it as well. So the slider isn't the maximum range. You can actually type even bigger numbers. Same for the strength. The strength goes up to 1, but you can actually type 2. So that's fixed. Now I'll fix the painting. Best to paint with a fairly small brush so you can paint in a lot of variation. Go with a tool strength of 1. It's also best purely aesthetically, but when you start painting landscapes, try to paint it with a system in mind. Try to come up with some form of system, like if it's near lava, it has this kind of material. If it's near a building, it has this kind of material. If it's near a rock, it has this kind of material. So the environment feels more consistent, and it feels more like as if the environment has gone through a certain evolution and there's a certain logic behind everything. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to stick to it 100%, but I'm going to stick to it somewhat, is say near lava I have this reddish thing. Directly after that I usually have this kind of rock surface. And then near rocks as well, perhaps, or actually near rock sand, and in between these two a bit of a mix between sand and this. But I'm quickly just gonna paint all the glowy bits away so I don't forget about those later on. Actually, I'll just increase the brush size and quickly do like this. And then, as you can see, we end up with a nicely varied landscape paint. Having that set and done, most of the level is now in place. There's a couple of smaller things to set up before we move on to things like lightning, the sky, those kind of things. So a couple of the smaller things still missing are actually lamps on the building and also some small foliage on the ground. So I'm gonna set those two up first. The lamps are easy, can do those first. It's very straightforward. Just find the lamp mesh in the content browser, add them to the building, and that's pretty much it. So there's two lamps here called lamp 1 and 3. Place them wherever you want, really. I'll add both of them first there. I'll go full screen so it's a bit easier to place. You can pretty much decide where you place them, really. It doesn't really matter too much. Maybe this one is placed against the wall here near the floor. You could also look at my original level and see where I placed them over there. This one I need both inside and outside, so I'll just duplicate it first. And first to the outside ones, which are much bigger. There's one in the center of the building at the top, which is horizontal, so I'll do that first. I'll add it to the beam in the middle, so it's nice and symmetrical. Should be much bigger. And then in the original level I have them on these slant surfaces. I'm going to do the same thing here. This might be a case where you want to turn off the rotation grid. Try to keep these grids on for as much as possible though, because it will make tweaking and changing the level later on much easier. Also, if other people take over, it will make their job much easier. However, in this case we can't really fix it with the grid at all, so I've turned off the rotation grid, rotating it like this. And actually there's a hole in the building, it seems. I missed that, so probably the same on this side. Also, you can see next to the building, I'm aware of that. I'm not gonna fix it for the video, but of course, to be good, you should be duplicating these meshes and extending them a bit more. Actually, the rotation grid is not on, so let me fix that first. I'm gonna place them in the middle here. Again, we can increase the grid all the way to 1024, and then they will pretty much instantly snap to the next one, so it's nice and simple. That's the end of the corridor. Then the foliage. In order to paint some small dry plants on the ground, I can show you the plants. They're located in flora, meshes, and you got these two. Doesn't really matter which of the two you use, you can use both as well. But in order to paint these, we don't want to be placing them manually. We don't want to do this. It's going to take a long time if you do that. Place them one by one, you know, and then copy it over. Of course, my grid is very big, that doesn't help, so make sure you turn the grid back. But copying them around like this is not going to be very fun to do, and it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of performance as well. So there's a built-in foliage paint tool which allows you to randomly scatter meshes around. It only works for things without collision, as I believe, unless it has been changed in the recent build, so it wouldn't have worked for the rocks. There's other ways of fixing the rocks though, other than what we've done here. What we've done here is the basic way, but the foliage tool focuses in particular on, as the name implies, foliage. So things with no collision. It's the fourth tab over here, foliage mode. And then first of all, you need to add these to the foliage mode window. So here it says drag static meshes from the content browser into this area. Let's do that. Make sure you drag them onto the actual line. You can see if I just drag them onto the panel, it doesn't do anything. Okay. So drag them onto the actual line of text and then they get added. If you add two of them, then it will paint both of them randomly. You can also remove one of the two. So I'm actually just going to paint with one to keep it easy, but I have two of them present here. There's a small X on the right side that allows you to remove it from the level again and from this area. If you remove it from this area, it also gets removed from the level if you would have painted it already. So with this selected, just hold Control again, left click and drag, and it might be hard to see on the video, but it has actually painted plants. These very small purple thingies there. There is plants here. Actually, let me add a light so it's easy to see. I'm just going to add a light in the middle of it. I'll turn off inverse squared follow again. I'll give it a much bigger radius. And you can see there's small plants here. In the foliage options here, you have density. Density is how many plants it paints. So if I go for 800 and I start painting again, I get many more of them. So that's obviously density. There's align to normal. I'm going to turn that off. Align to normal means that if you paint on a surface like, for example, this, the plants will align to the direction, to the normal of the surface, which is kind of weird for a plant because a plant tends to grow straight up no matter how it's where it's growing at. So I'm going to turn off align to normal. You can, by the way, unpaint things in the world if you Control Shift, click and drag, same like the landscape works. Then we have some random options here, random yaw, which is random rotation really, uniform scale, which is a good idea. You can set the scale here, so I'm going to say it should be between 1 and 2, so you get a more of a random scale going on. You can offset them slightly, that might be a good idea actually, so I'm going to offset them by 2. If you paint on steep surfaces, actually for example this, and you don't offset it, you might run the risk that part of the plant begins to float. Doesn't really happen with this kind of little bush, but if you have grass for example, which tends to be wider than this one, you might actually see part of it stick out because the mesh basically forms a line and it just sticks out on one side. So offsetting it downwards a little bit might be a good idea. You got random pitch, but it's not really needed for this kind of stuff. You got ground, slope and height, so you can actually do some kind of procedural painting where it automatically applies the foliage onto the landscape based on the slope and the height of the landscape. I'm not going to do that. You can also tie it to a landscape material, actually to a landscape layer, so it only shows up on those parts where you've painted rock for example, or sand or grass or etc. However, all of that is a bit too much for this introduction video, so I'm going to keep it simple. So just stick to these options and manually paint things around. And that's it. And again, try to keep a system into it. It will improve the visual outcome. So my system is going to be, I'm going to paint these mostly on where there is sand. So I won't paint them on rock, but mostly where there is sand. Okay, so we're done painting. One other thing here is that there is, you can press hide details, makes it smaller, makes it easy to manage in the window here. And also you can press show instant settings. And that one might be quite important if you want to do this properly and optimized. Because one of the properties available here is max instances per cluster, set to 100 by default. What this does is it batch renders these meshes. So it will take 100 of these little bushes together and it will render them as one mesh. So it automatically makes like one large object out of this, out of 100 of them, and then renders that as one. However, 100 is quite low, so I'm going to increase that to 200. So it will take 200 of these bushes and render them as one object. Every cluster is basically one draw call. So if you have more instances in a cluster, you would have fewer draw calls and it's better for performance. You can also set a start culling distance and end culling distance, making them disappear if you're more than this many units away from the plant. So basically the cluster, it works on a cluster basis, not on actual individual instance basis. But if I were to type 10,000 here and I would move 10,000 units away from the level, then it would hide all the foliage. And as you can see, there's also some lighting settings here like cast shadow, which you might want to consider. You can also see here there are currently 1369 instances in the level, which means there are 7 clusters. With the default 100, there would have been 14 clusters. So I tend to increase it a bit. Could actually go to 300, probably is even better for performance.